Vietnam War had many sounds, gunfire echoing through rice paddies, the distant rumble of artillery, the cries of soldiers in the jungle. But above them all, one sound came to define an entire generation of war. The deep, rhythmic thump of the Huey helicopter. To many, that sound meant salvation. To others, it meant the battle had just begun. Officially called the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, it became simply known as the Huey, a name born from its early Army designation, HU-1. It would go on to become the most recognizable helicopter in history. Before Vietnam, the helicopter was still a novelty in combat, used sparingly in Korea for medical evacuation and observation. But the dense jungles of Southeast Asia demanded something new, a machine that could move men and supplies anywhere, at any time. Bell Helicopter's engineers answered that call in the mid-1950s. The prototype flew in 1956, powered by a single turboshaft engine, a leap forward from the old piston designs. Light, agile, and fast, the Huey could lift troops, weapons, or the wounded with ease. The U.S. Army saw its potential immediately. By 1959, the first production models were delivered. The early UH-1A models could carry 6 troops. Later versions, like the UH-1D and UH-1H, expanded that to 11. It was simple to maintain, tough, and, most importantly, reliable. In the harsh, unpredictable terrain of Vietnam, reliability meant survival. By 1962, as American involvement deepened, Hueys began to appear over the jungles and paddies of South Vietnam. To soldiers on the ground, they were angels in the sky, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, or a ticket home if you were wounded. To enemy forces, they were a constant, terrifying presence, moving faster than any column of troops, striking before you could hide. And so, the Huey became not just a machine, but a symbol. It carried the war's lifeblood through the skies, soldiers, supplies, and hope, all beneath the steady rhythm of its spinning blades. The war had found its heartbeat. And it sounded like this. When the first Hueys arrived in Vietnam in 1962, they were unlike anything the battlefield had ever seen. Painted in olive drab, their slender bodies gleaming under the tropical sun, they looked almost fragile compared to the tanks and trucks of traditional war. But these machines were built for a new kind of fight, one without front lines. The early Hueys belonged to the U.S. Army's 57th Medical Detachment, whose mission was simple but life-saving, to rescue the wounded wherever they fell. Until then, it could take hours, sometimes days, for injured soldiers to reach medical help through the jungle or rough terrain. The Huey changed that forever. In its first months of service, the helicopter's ability to evacuate wounded soldiers in minutes instead of hours stunned commanders. Casualty survival rates skyrocketed. For the first time, the concept of Dustoff, emergency medical evacuation, became a central part of military doctrine. The name came from the dust clouds kicked up as the helicopters landed, often under fire, to pick up the injured. Many pilots of these early Dustoff missions were unarmed. They flew low, with open doors, trusting speed and courage more than armor or guns. Bullets whizzing, radio chatter, Dustoff inbound, taking fire. Their bravery became legend. One pilot described it this way. When you saw that red smoke on the ground, you knew someone down there needed you. You didn't think about the fire. You just went. The Huey had found its first and most sacred role, not as a weapon, but as a lifeline. But as U.S. involvement deepened, its mission quickly expanded. New variants like the UH-1B and UH-1C were outfitted with machine guns, rocket pods, and grenade launchers. Thus was born the Huey gunship. These armed versions escorted troop transports and attacked enemy positions before ground assaults. In the dense jungles where tanks could not roll and artillery struggled to find its mark, gunship Hueys became the soldiers' eyes, ears, and firepower. By 1964, entire air cavalry units were being formed around the helicopter. The 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, became the first large-scale experiment in helicopter warfare, troops, supplies, artillery, and command centers, all moving by air. The idea was revolutionary. Use speed and mobility to strike anywhere, anytime, before the enemy could even react. The Huey was at the heart of it. In training grounds across the United States, soldiers learned how to fast rope, land, and disembark under the whine of engines and the pounding of rotor wash. By the time they reached Vietnam, the Huey had become an extension of the soldier's world, a ride, a refuge, and often a home. Radio static, Eagle 6, we're inbound hot, 2 clicks out. By late 1965, the United States launched its first large-scale helicopter assault, the Battle of Ia Drang Valley. Hundreds of Hueys ferried in thousands of soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division into the heart of enemy territory. The sky above the Central Highlands roared with engines as wave after wave of helicopters brought troops, ammunition, and supplies into the fight and pulled the wounded back out. The operation tested everything: the concept of air mobility, the courage of the pilots, and the resilience of the machine itself. Many Hueys never made it back. Enemy fire, mechanical failure, and the sheer intensity of the missions took a brutal toll. But those that did returned scarred, their skins riddled with bullet holes, rotors cracked, yet still flying. After Ia Drang, no one doubted the helicopter's power again. The Huey had proven itself not just a tool, but a transformation. The war would never be the same. For the soldiers, the Huey became a symbol of movement, of connection, of life itself. Whether it was dropping them into a hot LZ or pulling them out of one, the sound of those blades meant they weren't alone. It was the sound of hope cutting through chaos. By 1966, the Huey was everywhere. It flew above rice paddies and river deltas, hovered over mountaintops, and roared through monsoon storms that grounded almost everything else. The helicopter had become the face and the sound of American power in Vietnam. But with that came danger unlike anything pilots had ever faced before. The enemy learned fast. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers began setting up ambushes specifically to target helicopters, using machine guns, anti-aircraft cannons, even small arms fired from the tree line. A single Huey, hovering to drop off troops or supplies, made an easy target. And every mission, every takeoff, was a gamble. Incoming fire, bullet impacts on metal. A pilot once said, "You never forgot your first time getting hit." You'd hear that ping 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 and wonder which one had your name on it. Yet they kept flying. Gunship Hueys, known as Hogsford Cobras before the UH-1 entered service, escorted troop carriers known as slicks. The slicks had no doors, no armor, just open benches and machine guns mounted by the crew chief and door gunner. Their job was to get soldiers in and out as fast as possible. The gunships followed behind, raining down machine gun fire and rockets to clear the landing zones. The teamwork between them was like a dance, chaotic, deadly, but precise. Door gunners often joked they had the best seat in the war, the wind in their face, the jungle whipping past, tracer round slicing through the air. But deep down, they knew every second in that seat could be their last. Many young gunners were barely 19 years old. They'd named their M60s, Sweet Mary, Betty Lou, Widowmaker. Each mission brought a mixture of adrenaline and dread. The Huey wasn't just transport, it was life and death, wrapped in aluminum and rotor blades. Pilots and crew formed tight-knit families. They trusted each other more than anyone else. One pilot described his door gunner like this: "He wasn't just a gunner. He was my right arm. If I went down, I knew he'd fight to the last round." These bonds carried them through the worst days. The Huey squadrons, or assault helicopter companies, often flew multiple missions per day. They'd insert troops at dawn, resupply them by midday, and pull out the wounded at dusk. Sleep was scarce. Maintenance crews worked through the night under dim red lights, patching bullet holes, changing rotors, refueling for the next day. The air bases, from Da Nang to Pleiku, never truly slept. The distant thump of blades became the soundtrack of every soldier's night. As the war escalated, the Huey's versatility expanded even further. There were E-slicks for troops, medevacs for the wounded, gunships for support, command and control versions for officers, and smoke ships that dropped colored smoke to mark landing zones or signal friendly units. Every variant had its role, and every role carried risk. In 1968, during the Tet Offensive, Hueys flew around the clock. They supplied isolated bases, evacuated wounded civilians, and ferried troops into the heart of burning cities like Huey and Saigon. It was one of the bloodiest years of the war, and the Huey was there for every moment. One medic recalled, "When we were surrounded in Huey, I remember hearing that whop 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 coming closer. The Huey broke through smoke and small arms fire to get us out. I don't know the pilot's name, but I'll never forget that sound." The war was brutal, but the Huey crews kept flying, mission after mission, often into zones so hot that even seasoned commanders hesitated to send them. Some called them crazy. Others called them heroes. Many of them were both. By the end of the 1960s, more than 5,000 Hueys were deployed in Vietnam. They carried troops, ammo, food, mail, water, even priests and dogs. They dropped leaflets, loudspeakers, and at times, psychological warfare broadcasts. They were everywhere, from the mountains of Khe Sanh to the mangrove swamps of the Mekong Delta. For the enemy, the Huey was an unstoppable ghost. It could appear from the tree line, unload a dozen soldiers, and vanish before anyone knew what happened. For the Americans and their allies, it was the glue holding the entire war effort together. But the constant danger took its toll. Thousands of Hueys were shot down during the war. Over 2,700 crew members were killed. Each loss was deeply felt by the soldiers who depended on them and by the brothers they left behind. In camp, some pilots painted names on their aircraft. The Godfather, Pale Rider, Easy Rider, Devil's Reject. For them, it was a way to make the machine feel human, to give the war's heartbeat a name. As the 1960s drew to a close, the Huey had become more than a helicopter. It was a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice, a flying witness to one of the most complex wars in modern history. Its rotors carried more than troops. They carried stories, memories, and ghosts. And those echoes would last long after the war was over. By 1970, the Vietnam War was grinding on into its second decade. The Huey was no longer a new machine, it was a veteran, worn and weathered, its green paint faded by tropical sun and monsoon rain. The pilots and crews who flew them were veterans too, some barely out of their teens, but aged beyond their years by what they'd seen. In the cockpit, there was a ritual before every mission. The crew chief would walk slowly around the aircraft, tapping the skin of the Huey, checking for new bullet holes or cracks. He would sling his helmet over his shoulder and say quietly, "All right, girl, let's do it again." They spoke to the Huey like it was alive. And in a way, it was. It had carried them through fire and monsoon, through chaos and rescue. It was their shield, their friend, their only way home. Fear was always there and never spoken, but always felt. Every crew member knew that at any moment, a lucky shot from below could end everything. One door gunner said, "I used to count the holes after we landed. It was like rolling dice with the devil." But between missions, laughter was their medicine. They played cards under the rotor shade, blasted rock music from tinny speakers, The Doors, Creedence, Hendrix. They painted shark teeth and pin-ups on their Hueys, tiny acts of rebellion against the violence around them. The pilots called each other by nicknames, Skipper, Tex, Cowboy. The bond was so tight that when a Huey went down, it hit the entire unit like a death in the family. By this time, the war was changing. American troops were gradually withdrawing, and the South Vietnamese forces were taking over more of the fighting. But the Huey remained, still flying the same missions, still taking the same risks. For many pilots, the hardest part was not combat, it was the constant tension, the waiting between flights. The sound of a distant explosion or the radio crackle could make their heart jump. Some found solace in letters from home. Others just stared at the sky, watching Hueys come and go, wondering which ones would return. One pilot wrote to his wife, "The Huey is louder than thunder but gentler than you'd think. When you're up there, it feels like you're riding the heartbeat of the world." The medevac crews, the Dustoffs, were the most revered. They flew without guns, without armor, just Red Cross symbols on their doors and a promise to bring the wounded home. They landed in jungles lit by flares, in villages under mortar fire, in fields still burning from napalm. To the men they rescued, they were angels with rotor wings. Radio static, Dustoff 27, wounded on the ground, request pickup. The Huey was never just a weapon. It was a savior, a messenger, a ghost of both hope and fear. By 1972, as the war neared its final stages, Hueys were still lifting off from 5 bases across South Vietnam, supporting ARVN troops, evacuating refugees, carrying deserters, and flying missions into Laos and Cambodia. The enemy fire had not lessened, if anything, it had grown deadlier. Shoulder-fired missiles and heavy machine guns were now common. Many pilots developed superstitions, lucky helmets, lucky scarves, photographs taped to the instrument panel. One crew kept a small plastic Buddha on the dashboard. Another painted the words "Fly me home." They believed in whatever might keep them alive. By the end of 1973, the United States was pulling out. The helicopters that remained were handed to the South Vietnamese Air Force. For many American pilots, leaving their Huey behind was like leaving a part of themselves. One wrote in his journal, "We called her a machine, but she had a soul. She saved lives, took lives, and never asked for anything in return." When they returned home, the pilots carried that sound with them. For some, the thump of a ceiling fan or the beat of a washing machine could send their minds back to the jungles of Vietnam. The Huey had become a part of them forever. By 1975, the Huey had been flying over Vietnam for more than a decade. It had carried soldiers into battle, lifted the wounded to safety, and outlasted thousands of men who once depended on it. But now, the war was ending. The Paris Peace Accords had collapsed, and the North Vietnamese army was advancing south, fast. South Vietnam was falling, city by city. And the Huey, that faithful machine, was once again at the center of it all. In April 1975, Saigon was surrounded. The skies above the city filled with the beating of rotor blades, hundreds of Hueys, flying non-stop evacuations. The mission was simple: get as many people out as possible. American civilians, diplomats, Vietnamese allies, all scrambling to escape before the city fell. The U.S. called it Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Frantic radio chatter: "We are overloaded! We are overloaded!" The Hueys flew from the embassy rooftop, from parking lots, from courtyards, any place a rotor could spin. Some carried 30, 40 people, far more than they were built for. The city below was chaos, crowds rushing the gates, desperate to get on board. One pilot later said, "We didn't look at faces. We just pulled people in until we couldn't fit another soul." The sound of those blades became a final heartbeat for a war that was dying. Many Hueys made their last flight that week. When the decks of the evacuation ships offshore grew too full, some pilots had to push their beloved helicopters into the sea to make room for the next incoming craft. They would hover above the water, drop their passengers onto the deck, and then lift off just long enough to ditch the aircraft into the waves. Dozens of Hueys sank beneath the South China Sea, proud machines swallowed by the war they had defined. For the men who flew them, it felt like a funeral. "It wasn't just metal we were losing," one pilot said. "It was years of our lives." At the U.S. Embassy, a single Huey kept landing again and again on the rooftop, ferrying people to safety until the very last moment. At 7:53 a.m. on April 30, 1975, the final call came over the radio. "Tiger! Tiger! Tiger!" The signal to end all evacuations. Minutes later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace. The war was over. The Huey's final mission in Vietnam had ended, not with victory, but with escape. Yet for millions watching the news, the images of those final flights, Hueys lifting from rooftops, refugees clinging to skids, helicopters falling into the sea, became the defining pictures of the war's end. The Huey had carried both the beginning and the end of America's longest war. It had come to symbolize more than military power. It symbolized the human cost, the courage, and the chaos that marked every chapter of Vietnam. Even today, that sound, thump-thump-thump, stirs something in those who remember. For veterans, it can mean rescue. For others, loss. For history, it means a machine that became a memory. The Huey's last flight over Saigon wasn't just the end of a war. It was the final echo of an entire era. When the guns finally fell silent in Vietnam, the Huey's mission didn't end. It had carried more than soldiers. It carried a generation. From the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta to the mountains of the Central Highlands, its blades had beaten through the heart of the 20th century's most divisive war. Over 7,000 Hueys served in Vietnam, the largest helicopter fleet ever assembled for a single conflict. More than 3,000 were lost in combat. But those that survived went on to fly in every corner of the world. In the years that followed, Hueys were adopted by dozens of nations, from Germany to Australia, from South Korea to Colombia. They fought wildfires, rescued flood victims, patrolled jungles, carried medical teams into disaster zones. The same sound that once meant war now meant life. Today, the Huey is still flying, in smaller roles, in civilian hands, and in museums where veterans stand quietly beside them, running their hands along the metal, remembering the smell of hydraulic fluid and the vibration of the floor. For many, stepping into a restored Huey is like stepping back in time. At airshows, you'll see old pilots, their hair grey, standing with tears in their eyes as the rotors begin to turn. That sound, the deep, pulsing whoop-whoop-whoop, brings it all back, the fear, the adrenaline, the camaraderie. The Huey changed how wars were fought. It pioneered the idea of air mobility, soldiers moving by helicopter instead of roads. It reshaped tactics, logistics, and rescue operations forever. Modern aircraft like the Black Hawk and Apache owe their existence to the lessons learned from the Huey's time in Vietnam. But the Huey's greatest legacy isn't technological. Its human. It represents courage under fire, of pilots who flew into impossible situations, of medics who risked everything to save one more man, of crews who turned a fragile machine into a lifeline. The Huey became a bridge between life and death, between hope and despair. It was a weapon, a rescue, a home in the sky. And when it left Vietnam for the last time, it took with it the memories of millions, soldiers and civilians, allies and enemies alike. Decades later, the Huey still appears in films, documentaries, and songs. Its sound instantly transports us back to that era, an era of chaos, courage, and change. The Huey is more than history. It's memory, preserved in motion. As one veteran said, "You never forget the Huey. You can close your eyes, and it's still there, the wind in your face, the smell of smoke and fuel, the rhythm that meant you were alive." In the jungles of Vietnam, the Huey was the voice of an empire and the prayer of a soldier. It carried pain and hope in equal measure. And even now, when the last Hueys lift off into the sunset, their echo reminds us of the war that changed everything, and the machine that carried its soul. The Huey helicopter, the sound of Vietnam.